In this lecture, we will be examining the emergence of a period in American history known as the Progressive Era. This is a brief overview of the time period. Pictured in this image are women who organized themselves as the Housewives Alliance to protest unsanitary conditions at meatpacking facilities and to demand legislative action to protect consumers. Such organized responses to social, economic, and political problems were an important feature of the Progressive Era. There's no simple definition of dates or characteristics of the Progressive Era. In a general sense, the period runs from roughly the 1890s until approximately 1920, though elements of progressive reform appeared in the United States well before and well after these rough time definitions. As we will see in this lecture, progressive reform took on many different configurations, and progressive reformers exhibited many different political and philosophical tendencies. Some progressive era reformers approached social problems from the left of the political spectrum, while others possessed free market ideologies and wanted a greater role for business and business leaders in bringing about needed reforms. There were a number of social, political, and economic problems that emerged in the United States toward the end of the 19th century that progressive reformers wanted to address. Many Americans were concerned about the great gap between the wealthiest and poorest Americans. In addition, the significant political and financial power of wealthy Americans caused concern among many citizens. There was perhaps a general sense that a handful of wealthy individuals had disproportionate power and influence, especially when it came to matters of public policy. The cartoon image here should be familiar to many folks, is a character known as Rich Uncle Pennybags, best known from the board game Monopoly, the precursor to which was invented in 1904. This cartoon in many ways represents the popular perception that America's wealthy lived carefree lives far removed from the struggles of everyday Americans. These ostentatious, showy displays of wealth led to anger among many poor and working class Americans. American industrial workers were for the most part quite poor as the 19th century ended. Many American workers lived in dilapidated housing, and they worked in dangerous factory settings for low wages. Photojournalist Jacob Riis, who's pictured on your left, documented many of the problems of America's poor people in his 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives. The book was a precursor to the style of journalism known as muckraking, which we will address in a few slides. Riis and his photography brought a wide audience knowledge of the extreme poverty of the slums of New York City. The Progressive Era was also a time period where little attention was paid by the government and the mainstream white America to the problems faced by African Americans, especially in the case of former slaves and their children. The Progressive Era was noted for the rise of a group of reformers loosely referred to as the social gospel movement. These individuals used Christian ethical traditions to provide solutions to social problems like poverty, crime, slums, child labor, and unsanitary conditions. One of the leading proponents, pictured here, of the social gospel movement was Walter Rauschenbusch. He was a Baptist minister in a church in the notorious Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of New York City. Rauschenbusch developed a variety of Christian theology that provided a scriptural basis for the obligations of Christians to help the poor and the needy. A more practical and hands-on approach to reform in the Progressive Era took the form of the settlement house movement, which began in the 1880s and reached its peak in the early 1920s. The movement emerged in both England and the U.S. In fact, the first settlement house examples appeared in London. The settlement houses were designed to bring together the wealthy and the poor in an effort to create something of an interdependent community. These so-called settlement houses typically opened in poor urban areas. They'd be staffed by middle-class and upper-class volunteers who would share their knowledge and culture with their neighbors, and by extension help alleviate the poverty of these low-income neighbors. By 1913, there were 413 settlement houses in 32 states in the United States. The most famous of the settlement houses was known as Hull House, which is pictured in the slide on the right-hand side. It was created in Chicago by Jane Addams, who's also depicted here. Hull House offered educational and cultural opportunities to poor immigrants and poor women that they might not have otherwise been able to access. Another type of progressive era reformer was journalists who used their positions as influential writers to shape public opinion and promote reform policies. The term muckraker refers to a journalist who digs through barriers to expose hidden truth. This might take the form of an expose on poor living conditions or unsafe working conditions. It might take the form of an expose on corruption by government officials and industrial managers. Lincoln Steffens, who's pictured on your left, was a reporter who composed articles in the influential magazine McClure's that exposed corruption in municipal governments. This would later be published in an influential text known as The Shame of the Cities. Nellie Bly, pictured on your right, was the pen name of American journalist Elizabeth Jane Cochran. Bly covered the Mexican Revolution for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and after she joined the New York World, she actually faked insanity to get admitted to an asylum in order to expose the abysmal conditions at the facility. Groundbreaking journalists, both. It is important to note that many progressive era reformers were motivated as much by the fear of socialist or communist revolution as they were by a zeal to bring about change. In general, progressive era reformers were people who wanted to work within the existing political and economic structures to improve American society, as opposed to advocating revolution. Many reformers, especially those with business backgrounds, emphasized the necessity for efficiency in reform policies. For example, pictured here is Frederick W. Taylor. He was a mechanical engineer who spent a great deal of time researching human activity to find ways to make work more efficient. His 1911 book, entitled The Principles of Scientific Management, was as influential in reform movements as it was in American industry. For many progressive era reformers, one of the most important considerations was to strengthen American families. Many progressives promoted policies that were designed to improve living conditions and to provide healthy food or improve access to health care, and generally promote keeping families together. The image on this slide is of Denver Judge Ben Lindsay and his wife Henrietta. Lindsay and his wife worked tirelessly for decades on a number of reform projects, and Lindsay is noted for the establishment of a juvenile court that focused on keeping troubled teenagers in the community instead of throwing them in jail. Lindsay believed it was much more effective to work with at-risk children before they engaged in serious criminal activity than to spend resources incarcerating juveniles and later, by extension, incarcerating adults. For many progressive reformers, an important goal was to create order out of situations that seemed chaotic. One example of this trend was the emergence of the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, which emerged in 1910. President Theodore Roosevelt was among the American progressives who encouraged the development of the NCAA. Many sports at the time had rules that varied widely from league to league, and sometimes between teams in a given league. It is surprising for many 21st century Americans to realize that it was not until 1921 that the federal government first created and published a federal budget. This is another example of reformers seeking to bring greater order and accountability to government. This also reflects one group of reformers who believed that business leaders were the best persons to lead reform, since they possessed real-world experience and they knew how to efficiently run an organization. Other progressive era reformers, I should note, saw government itself as the principal means by which order-based reforms should be carried out. Finally, some progressive era reformers sought to make society more moral and more just. The aspiration to distribute income more equitably was a feature of many progressive era reformers, though the exact means by which this would occur differed. Some, of course, favored government intervention, while others instead believed private efforts would work better. Most progressive era reformers sought to expand opportunities for individual improvement and advancement. Women such as Susan B. Anthony made equality a centerpiece of progressive era reforms. In addition to Anthony's role in the women's rights movement, she was also involved in the temperance movement and the abolitionist movements. This draws to a close our brief overview of progressive era.